Welcome to Psychology 230. This is Lecture 1, Introduction to Brain and Behavior, and it corresponds to Chapter 1 of your textbook. Before we get going, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Mallory Klaunig, and I'm your instructor. You can contact me through email. This is the best way to contact me. If you want to chat or have something you want to talk about that isn't best expressed through email, you can always set an appointment with me through Google Hangout. We can do the video function or the chat function, whichever you're most comfortable with. We can also just do a voice call through Google. I am currently working from Baltimore, Maryland this semester. I'll explain that in a second, but I just want to mention it because I am in a different time zone. I'm in the Eastern time zone, which is 6 hours ahead of Hawaii. This hasn't been an issue in the past. I've been here for the last few semesters, so hopefully it won't be an issue this semester either. I will always aim to respond to student emails within 48 weekday hours. I can't guarantee a response on weekends or holidays, but I often do respond to emails on weekends and holidays. I just can't say for sure that I'll be able to respond to you immediately. Please don't hesitate to contact me. It's my job to help you understand the course material. It's my job to make sure you understand the rules of the course as well. So please do contact me. A little bit about my clinical and research background, so you can kind of understand where I'm coming from as we go through this material together. I did 2 years of master's work in neurocognitive psychology at the University of Munich in Germany before moving to Hawaii, where I got a master's in clinical psychology from UH Manoa, and I am currently finishing up my PhD in clinical psychology. I'll be done this summer, also from UH Manoa. I'm currently on clinical internship for the PhD. This is kind of akin to medical residency, where we do 1 year of clinical work, mostly clinical work, in an outside institution. So I'm at University of Maryland in Baltimore doing that. My specific areas of research I've mostly done work in the neurobiology of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, also affective disorders such as bipolar disorder. I'm really interested in the prediction and prevention of schizophrenia, transdiagnostic perspectives on mental illness. So transdiagnostic perspective is, for those of you who may not be familiar, it's a way of looking at mental illness as symptom dimensions rather than distinct diagnostic categories. So rather than looking at anxiety, depression, psychosis, or schizophrenia, you're looking at kind of the symptoms that comprise those disorders and looking at how those symptoms overlap in different disorders. And I'm happy to give anyone more information about this because I think it's kind of the way of the future in mental illness. I'm also interested in international perspectives on mental illness, especially psychosis. I'm doing my dissertation in South Africa. I was there last year doing the dissertation work and finishing that up right now. And I'm interested generally in mental health systems and how mental illness is conceptualized in sub-Saharan regions of Africa and other low resource areas. My clinical focus, which is not terribly relevant to this course, but in a clinical psychology PhD, we do both clinical work and research. So my clinical focus is very close to my research work. I study serious mental illness, early stages of psychosis. So I work with people who have recently developed psychosis or who are at risk for developing psychotic disorders. And I work in populations where cross-cultural considerations are prominent. So in Baltimore, we have a lot of cross-cultural considerations with a lot of different racial and ethnic groups, and also people, a lot of immigrant groups. And of course, when I was in Hawaii, it was particularly interesting to me the way that different cultures intersected and the way that different cultures dealt with the treatment of mental illness. And cultural considerations, I think, are very important in general and something that we will try to touch on as much as possible in this course in the context of psychobiology. The syllabus is in the resource section of Lau Lima, and one of your readings for this week, in addition to chapter 1 of the textbook, is to read the syllabus. But I'm going to kind of highlight some points from the syllabus. So in this course, each week you will complete readings from the required textbook, and that's on the schedule at the bottom of the syllabus. You'll watch the lecture on the YouTube channel. There's a link to that on the resources page, or you can just listen to the lecture, which is recorded over the PowerPoints. So you can click on the little microphone guy at the bottom of each slide and just listen to each slide separately. Every week the homework will be due at 11 p.m. on Sunday. If you're late submitting the homework, I will have to take off points for every 24-hour period. So 5 points off for every 24-hour period that you're late on the homework. Some weeks you'll have an exam. This will be due by Sunday 11 p.m. at the latest, and you'll typically have an hour to complete the exam. If you if you need accommodations, if you have any learning disability or other limitations that make time limits difficult, please contact me well before the exam, and we can work with that. Again, absolutely contact me if you're unclear about any information on the syllabus. However, as is always the case, please don't email me asking a question that's clearly stated on the syllabus without having read the syllabus. So if you're asking me like when homework 1 is due, this is on the syllabus. So please don't email me asking that unless something is unclear to you. And then finally, the syllabus is subject to change. So I'm going to do my best to tailor this course to your unique interests. And homework 1, I'm going to do a bit of a survey asking you about your interests in this course and in psychobiology in general. And every semester I try to make sure that some of the examples and some of the ways that I cover the material are tailored to the interests of the people in this class. This is a little unusual, I think, for an undergraduate course, but I do grant extensions, and I'm happy to grant extensions, up to 3 extensions per person on an individual basis. So if you have a really busy week and you anticipate having difficulty completing an exam or a homework, contact me before the weekend in Hawaii time, and request an extension. I'll typically give you a 3-day extension. If you need a little bit more, that's fine too. Just let me know. And this is not something I'll hold against you or consider you to be irresponsible. It's something I like to offer in order to make this course a little bit flexible, as I understand that people take online courses in part due to the flexibility. Concerning the course material, I will typically follow the structure of the book in the lectures, but there are exceptions. There are relatively rare times where I disagree with some of the material in the book, or just think that certain sections are not as important, and so I'll leave those out. Lectures will be brief relative to a typical in-person class session for the most part. There's 1 or 2 lectures that are on the longer side. But because this is not like a in-class format, the lectures are going to be typically 30 to 40 minutes, I think. And the lecture material takes precedent over the book material. So if a topic is framed differently in the lecture as compared to the book, you'll defer to the lecture material. However, and please use the lecture as a guide for which information is most important from the textbook. However, it is still important to read the textbook, as textbook material will be covered in exams, and there's also just, they have a lot of examples and things like this in the textbook that can really flesh out some of the ideas that we're talking about. Every week I'm going to have this page of announcements and reminders. Very important that you pay attention to this. Sometimes there will be changes to the syllabus or changes maybe to deadlines and things like this that will be on this page. Typically, if something is really important, I also send out a La Lima announcement, but in general, it's very important that you pay attention to the announcements and reminders page every week. So the only announcement I have this week is that homework 1 is due this Sunday, the 13th at 11 p.m. And this homework assignment can be accessed via La Lima in the Assignments, Tests, and Surveys tab. On to the course material. This is Lecture 1, Introduction to Brain and Behavior, and this corresponds to Chapter 1 of the textbook. I do want to note that I often record the introductory portion of the lecture separately from the course material part, so my voice might sound different based on my level of caffeination, and there might be different background noises. There's not always a very smooth transition either, so I apologize if that is distracting.
And chapter 1 was about the basics. So what is psychobiology? It's the study of the biological basis of emotion, cognition, and behavior. So essentially the biological basis of psychology. And I assume that most of you are interested, at least somewhat interested in psychology and the brain if you're taking these courses. But why study the brain? Because there are a lot of unanswered questions regarding the brain. We don't actually know that much about the brain, considering how much time and effort we've spent researching the brain. So scientists have only recently mapped the nervous system, or the entire brain and the rest of the nervous system of this C. elegans roundworm, which is a pretty small and simple organism. It only has 302 neurons and over 7,000 connections between the neurons. So it's a relatively small neural system, and only recently have we mapped this. Humans, on the other hand, have about 86 billion neurons with trillions of connections, indicating that we're quite a long way from understanding the complexity of the human brain. If you're interested in C. elegans and in this map that scientists have recently created, there's a website right here. So I'll refer a lot of times to websites and additional information in the lecture. You're not going to be responsible for that information, it's just if you're interested. And why study the brain as well? There are practical reasons. Many medical and psychological disorders originate in the brain. So for example, I study schizophrenia, and a big part of schizophrenia is observable changes that happen in the brain, dysregulation of dopamine, decreases in the volume of certain areas in the brain. And so we can learn a lot about treatments and causes of medical and psychological disorders by studying the brain. The nervous system is broken into a couple parts. There's the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is what you think of, I think, when most people think of psychobiology or neuroscience. It's the brain and the spinal cord. And the spinal cord connects the brain to the rest of the body. In the peripheral nervous system, the periphery being like the outside part, right? So it's outside of the central nervous system. The nerves and this includes the nerves and the neuronal processes outside of the brain and spinal cord, and it's comprised of sensory and motor connections to and from the central nervous system. So it takes information from the body like touch, it takes information from the body like touch, brings it up to the central nervous system, and then the central nervous system sends that information to complete actions. A neuron is a nerve cell within the body, within the nervous system, and neurons communicate with each other, and we're going to cover a lot of that in the second chapter. The cerebrum, which is also called the forebrain, is the main part of the brain. It's what you're used to seeing when you look at the picture of the brain, and it's responsible for most of our conscious thoughts. So it's responsible for these higher level functions. The brainstem is the lower center part of the brain, if you can see in this middle picture, this color part in the middle picture, and it includes the pons, medulla, midbrain, and diencephalon. Some people include the cerebellum in the brainstem, but this is more typically considered to be a separate component. So the brainstem is kind of like the old part of the brain. People call it like the reptilian part of the brain, meaning like it's, in terms of evolution, it was one of the first parts of the brain to evolve, so it's responsible for a lot of basic functions. And then the cerebellum, which actually means like a little cerebrum. It looks like a tiny brain stuck in the back of the neck. And this plays a big part in learning and coordinating movements, has many connections with the cerebrum, And the cerebellum is actually a really interesting part of the brain. We're going to cover it a bit more in a later section, but we're finding out more and more that it plays a role in higher cognitive and emotional functions. Before, we often just considered it to be mostly responsible for movement, but we're learning that it's a little more complex than that. Section 2, Historical Perspectives on Brain and Behavior. Neuroscience and psychobiology have a long history in philosophy. So before people were really studying the brain, they were studying the brain directly necessarily. Before we had MRI and all these other neuroimaging techniques, philosophers like Aristotle were coming up with ideas of how they thought the brain and behavior connect. So Aristotle ascribed to a school of thought called mentalism, and he believed that the psyche, which is essentially there was a psyche, which is essentially the idea of the mind, untouchable, intangible entity that's responsible for conscious awareness and cognition. And mentalism is the idea that the mind is responsible for behavior, which to us is really, most people would consider that to be obvious now, but back in Aristotle's time that was not a given. It was a newer idea. Then many years later, Descartes, who was considered kind of the father of modern philosophy, came up with dualism. And dualism is the idea that the mind and the body are actually separate entities. So Descartes believed that the mind and the body interact through the pineal gland, which we now know is not correct. But he believed that there was a separate physical brain and mind, and they just happen to run parallel to each other. So the dualism, most people don't agree with dualism right now. Obviously, this entire course is built on the idea that dualism is not correct, that the mind and behavior, mind and the body are the same, that the mind is just the workings of the brain. And one problem with dualism is the mind-body problem, which is the difficulty of explaining how this non-material mind and a material body could interact. And dualists, there are modern dualists, and they've tried to kind of come up with explanations of that, but they're typically not satisfactory. And then later scientists and thinkers included Darwin, who was most famous for his theories of evolution, Mendel, who came up with some basic rules of genetics and how we inherit characteristics. And more recently, a lot of scientists have been very interested in epigenetics. So epigenetics is the observation that genes can be expressed in different ways depending on environmental influences. So depending on maybe if somebody has a genetic predisposition for a certain for obesity, these genes can be turned on or off based on things in the environment. All of these ideas also help us understand that all species are related, and therefore their brain and behavior must be related. So the brain and behavior of more complex species evolved from simpler species. A long time ago, we were a much simpler form of animal. Humans were a much simpler form of animal, and we sort of, as we evolved, we kind of left behind simpler forms of life. And then there's materialism, which is the idea that the brain and the nervous system are enough to explain behavior without having to talk about the mind. So this is the idea that it's not so much that the mind and the brain are the same thing, it's that there's no such thing as the mind and all we have is the brain, and that explains all of behavior. More about the modern brain and behavior perspectives, there's eliminative materialism, which is the idea that there's no need to talk of non-substance mental explanations of behavior if the behavior can be explained wholly by the nervous system. So it's a strong version of materialism, within this belief, or within this idea of eliminative materialism, beliefs and thoughts are just brain processes. So it's something that it's something physical that happens, physical and chemical that happens in the brain. And according to this belief, the more that we know about how the brain works, the less we'll have to depend on these kind of psychological phenomena such as depression, anxiety, things like this. And again, this is a very strong version of materialism. A lot of people have beliefs that are more somewhere along the spectrum of materialism. So most people who study the brain accept some form of materialism, but recognize that since we don't know everything about the brain, we have to use these kind of mental constructs like belief, pain, attention, depression, anxiety, etc. Okay, moving on to sections 3 and 4, evolution of the nervous system. The first brain cells evolved around 700,000 million years ago, which is a very long time ago. And the first brain, which is like a connection of brain cells, evolved around 250 million years ago. The modern human brain, as we know it, is relatively young, only 200,000 years old. Within the 5 kingdoms of organisms that you might remember from biology classes, only animals have nervous systems and muscles. So when we talk about the nervous system, we're talking only about animals. The simplest and earliest form of the nervous system was called the nerve net, and there are very simple organisms that still exist today that have a nerve net, which is essentially just throughout the body a kind of loose connection of nerve cells. So no centralized brain, just this sort of net of neurons throughout the body. And over time, nervous systems became increasingly more organized, complex, maybe localized, culminating with the modern human brain, which is the most complex nervous system. Humans are primates, and we evolved from the same ancestors as other apes that still exist. So we didn't necessarily evolve from apes that are existing, but we have common ancestors. In general, brain size is in proportion to body size increases with intelligence. So the bigger the proportion of your brain in relative to your body, the more intelligent as an organism. This isn't necessarily for people, but for species in general. Primates in general have good color vision. We're good at distinguishing color. We can see red and green distinctions, most of us can at least. We have forward-facing eyes that allow for depth perception and strong vision, so the visual system is particularly evolved to be strong in primates. The earliest remains from our genus, from the human genus Homo, were found in Ethiopia. And here's a picture of some of the earliest human remains. This is a jawbone at the bottom here. As the ancestors of humans evolved, brain size increased, particularly the size of the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is this, literally the lobe that's in the front part of your brain, and it's associated with the most complex functions, executive functions we call them. So intelligence in humans is associated with the fact that our frontal lobe is bigger than a lot of other primates. And as our frontal lobes increased, the complexity of tools that we used also increased based on anthropological and archaeological findings. And so we can assume that as the frontal lobe increased, humans became more intelligent based on this kind of proxy measure of how complex the tools were that they were using. Modern humans, us, were Homo sapiens sapiens, appearing 200,000 years ago, which is relatively young in terms of the scale of how long animals and living organisms have been around. Neanderthals existed alongside modern humans and died out probably only 40,000 years ago. So there was quite a bit of time that Neanderthals and modern humans were existing side by side. There's there used to be kind of the belief that Neanderthals were really, really basic and not that intelligent or complex, but actually there's more and more indication that they were relatively complex and had like culture and language, religious beliefs, and there's actually some interesting findings that they had brain sizes that were the same or maybe even slightly larger than modern humans. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they were more intelligent than modern humans, but it's just kind of interesting that they at least had comparable brain sizes. So the brain size ratio that I talked about before, the proportion, is called the encephalization quotient, which is the ratio of actual brain size to expected brain size based on the body of a given animal. So if you look at the graph on the right, there's this regression line, which is what you would expect the brain size of an animal to be based on its body size. So a dog and a raccoon, these are pretty close to what you would expect, kind of an average encephalization quotient. The farther above the trend line an animal falls, the more intelligent it tends to be. So you see monkeys and Homo sapiens there. They tend to be a little more intelligent. And the farther below the trend line an animal falls, the less intelligent it tends to be. So rhinos, kind of dumb. Moles, I guess pretty dumb for their body size. But this is a really rough estimate. This ratio is a really rough estimate, and so it's not the whole picture. There's also, excuse me, density of brain cells, density of neurons that have to be taken into account. So your brain could be, you could have two brains that were the same size, but one of them is denser and is packed with more neurons, and the denser brain would be associated with higher level of intelligence. So why did the humanoid brain get so large and densely packed? There are, obviously we don't know for sure, but there are a number of ideas. One could be a response to changing climates in East Africa. So the out of Africa theory is that modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, and even some versions before this, Homo erectus and Neanderthals, were originally in East Africa, so in this area around Ethiopia and Kenya. There's this big valley in that region where a lot of the oldest specimens of humans are found. And it's believed that changes in climate caused the first modern humans to leave Africa, and so they had to adapt to this changing environment that they were leaving. There are also evidence, like the larger the social group gets, the more cognitively complex an organism needs to be to keep track of all these social connections. And then a hunter-gatherer lifestyle is actually conducive to, or was conducive to, increasing in intelligence. You have to be able to remember, if you're a hunter, you have to be able to plan and problem solve and outsmart your prey. And if you're a gatherer, you have to remember where things are. You have to be able to identify different plants, figure out what's poisonous and what is not. And so a lot of these lifestyles may have selected for more intelligent Homo species. As well, it's believed that the discovery of fire and therefore the cooking of food might have made it possible to save food longer, allowing for greater caloric intake with less time devoted to finding food. So if you cook meat, it can stay longer, it can keep longer. As well, you don't have to spend as much time. Cooked food tends to be more easily digested, so you're not spending as much energy digesting food, and then less mastication or chewing. If your food is cooked, you don't have to chew as much, which allows for smaller jawbones, which allows for more room for the skull to grow, which might seem kind of far-fetched, but there's some indication that the more intelligent Homos became, the smaller the jaw size was. Changes in the skull shape also appears to allow for more blood flow to the brain. So there's something called neoteny, which is juvenile characteristics that are retained into adulthood that allow for greater periods of learning and development. So the idea with neoteny is that the longer an organism has its young in juvenile periods, kind of the more development can happen. So for humans, we have a really long developmental period. I mean, we're not considered adults until we're 18 years old, whereas a giraffe is born pretty much able to stand within a few minutes, immediately able to run away from prey. So this kind of prolonged period where someone is taking care of us when we're young allows for more cognitive functions and more complex learning and development. Kind of a sort of a version of neoteny, or maybe in contrast to neoteny, some people believe that we go through each stage of development, but these stages are just prolonged relative to other apes. So neoteny is more that that more intelligent species never go through these later developmental stages. And a contrasting viewpoint to that is that we do go through these stages, but they're just longer. Okay, so section 5, the modern human brain. So the question is, does size matter? So does the size of a brain of an individual matter? And the answer appears to be sometimes it matters, but not always. So larger brains are associated with higher IQs if a person's brain, for developmental reasons, is really, really small. So there are certain developmental disorders that retard the growth of the brain, and this is associated with a lower IQ. However, men, as compared to women and larger people, just physically larger people, tend to also have larger brains, but this is not necessarily correlated with higher IQs. So there are some caveats to an association between brain size and intelligence in individuals. However, there are some factors that influence, some kind of like third factors that may influence an association between body size and IQ, like good nutrition. So if somebody has good nutrition, they're probably going to be taller, they're probably going to be larger, and they're probably going to have a higher IQ as well. Intelligence is also a really complicated construct. We have intelligence tests, but they're culturally biased, and they only measure one form of intelligence pretty much. They measure cognitive functions, but they don't measure emotional intelligence, they don't measure, some people would argue that athletic ability is a form of intelligence, like being able to perform complex motor skills is a form of intelligence. So the question of whether brain size correlates with intelligence can be kind of complicated. One really important aspect of the modern human brain is that it's plastic. Plasticity means a potential for change, chemical and physical change. So when you learn things, anytime you learn things, your brain is changing in structure, and this is plasticity. It's the ability of the brain to change in structure and function to adapt to the environment. And we will talk a bit more about brain plasticity in a later chapter as well. Compared to some other species, the modern human brain evolved relatively rapidly, and increasing complexity of the brain was associated with increasing complexity in culture. So just like how we saw increased area of the frontal lobe being associated with increased complexity in tools, we also see bigger brain, bigger frontal lobes, more complexity of the brain being associated with more complex culture. Culture being the learned behaviors and beliefs that are passed down from generation to generation. And there are indications of culture or some kind of like recording of daily life as early as like almost 40,000 years ago. So there are cave drawings in Indonesia, which is the oldest known figurative art, and this is as old as 35,000 years ago. This pig deer is about 35,000 years old, and there's a hand that appears to be about 40,000 years old. So the takeaway of this chapter in general is that the modern human brain is rather special. It's the most complex organ that we have. The human brain is the most complex out of any organism, and there's still a lot that we don't know about it. There's still a lot to be learned.